So thank you for inviting me. I believe this project is extremely significant in the context of sport and gender, and therefore I'm very keen to contribute to while you are working on this particular archive and the toolkit or the sort of curriculum that you are going to create for media persons. I think it's an extremely important piece of work because media has played such an important role in making what women's sport is today to people who to fans, for example. Um, the discourse around women's sport. Um, and it's quite a big thing at this point, given also if you notice the improvements and the developments in the field of football. Women's sport across countries internationally is developing in a very fast way. So I think it's a very important project from that particular point of view. And in my 15 years of work as an activist, I have had several opportunities to work with journalists. And in fact, very close collaborations have also often taken place, especially in the context of investigative journalism in sport. I have had great allies with whom I have been able to work because there is a commonality there as to trying to create a different kind of sport, trying to create a space which is much safer for athletes, trying to create a space which is more equal. So there is that commonality between many of these investigative journalists who want to change sport for better, and so is the case for defenders of athletes' rights like me, where we also want sport to change for the better. Having been an athlete in the past myself, and sort of facing certain kind of um, abuse, as in the sense of coaches abuse, verbal, physical abuse. Um, I was quite sort of aware even as an athlete. Later on, I became a coach as well, and also did my research under Shukya Chaudhary as part of the School of Women's Studies in Geneva University. When I started working as an activist, it wasn't a formal decision. My first engagement a, with a particular athlete who was sex tested was Shanti Soundarajan. And that was, Shanti was banned from competing in 2006 when I was still a PhD student. But in 2009, I started working so connecting with her, and by 2010 I had met her and I did a video interview of her and all of that. Um, from then on, the journey has been about sort of speaking to these athletes, understanding them in a way which nobody has tried before. So it was quite, can't say it myself, but it was the first of a kind in many ways. So nobody was really reaching out to these athletes. There was that culture of, sort of suspicion um, around these athletes. So no one was directly speaking to them. They were looked at as cheaters. So you don't go and speak to cheaters. So they were treated as any doper in the field of sport would be treated as. So from that to think of their rights, that they have rights which are being violated in the process, was a different kind of sensitivity that I was bringing in to these conversations. And it started with Shanti, then with Pinky. And during Pinky's case, when I got directly involved in giving interviews in television panels, whether it was in national media or even in Bengal, it was a huge thing. For weeks, it was the sort of headline news in print, sort of Anand Bajar, Putrika, or everywhere basically. And nationally also, it did sort of get a lot of attention. And the question initially raised at that time, I very clearly remember, was about whether this athlete who has represented India as a woman is really a woman. And her gender was constantly questioned. And the first and major thing that I had to do through my intervention in all these media panels and everything was the fact that you first need to understand that everyone deserves a fair trial. There was a complaint around sexual harassment against her, and at that time, the Indian law said that only a man can rape, and therefore from that this question about whether she is a man or woman came to sort of change that conversation in the media. The question, to the point of having fair trial. Everybody has a right to fair trial. Also, the fact that what the sport regulations say, and uh, how one cannot question someone's gender. These conversations was gradually sort of being raised. And in 21 days, when Pinky was released from jail, um, it was sort of, the conversations of then very much changed. And we were talking about how she was, what she was experiencing in the jail. So Pinky's case was very extreme as well. The kind of, scrutiny of her body that happened, forcefully tied her, they tied her hands in the hospital and removed her clothes and all kinds of very sort of very difficult situation through which she had to go through with this physical examination done and photographed while the doctors were physically examined. She was photographed as well for research purposes, and nobody is given any right to sort of, give consent to research, etc. So all of those things happened, and nobody was talking about that. The people and the media was only talking about whether she's a man or a woman, whether she had the right to compete for the country as a woman. These were the conversations. So what we did for those 3 weeks while she was in jail, and we were trying hard to get her out of the jail, was also to sort of change this conversation in popular media around whether she's a man or woman, to conversations around whether she deserves a fair trial, what kind of human rights violations have taken place, what does the sport regulation really say, whether it tries to determine someone's gender, to when she comes out finally 21 days later, talking about her rights, but at the same time, questions around, you medical records being publicly shared. And this has happened with many intersex people in the past, in other parts of the world. There is a sense of curiosity about bodies where you are not, where they're not typically female or typically male. And it serves some kind of, people, media loves to sensationalize it, people love to read it. So that was happening without really paying any attention to this individual person, about whose body we were constantly discussing. While people are questioning whether she has at all sexually assaulted someone, there was an allegation of that sort. No one was really talking about this accused person's rights. So it was very different as a case and very sensationalizing. And we were able to change the direction in which the conversation started in a very in a positive way, I felt. I remember one particular incident on the day she was finally released. And she appeared in that very program from her home in Baguihati, and the studio was, in central Calcutta somewhere. As far as I remember, and I had an interview with the NDTV in Onil Rai Road, and then I traveled to this place. By that time, the program had started. There were other speakers, and for an hour, they were supposed to discuss. So she was in Baguihati after being released at her home, and they got her from there. She was present. There were other speakers, lawyers, doctors, etc., in the studio. And I entered there. And then there's this particular journalist, I've forgotten his name, who appeared on a monitor speaking from a certain place, Lal Bajar, near Lal Bajar, and saying, পুলিশ সূত্রে এবং অন্য সূত্রে জানা গিয়েছে, from police sources and other sources, we have come to know what exactly the medical report of Pinky Pramanik is saying. And then he starts reading certain things from whatever the medical report was. I was furious, and I did not care that I was on camera, and I started, sort of screaming, I think, about the fact that if I am tested today, my blood report would be announced first to the media, and police has no right to give information away to the journalist, and the journalist ethically shouldn't be reading out in live television, on live television. So I was very furious and I started screaming, and there was a huge sort of, it was a 1 hour program which got extended to 1.5 hours. Shundita was anchoring the, who later passed away. Shundita was anchoring that particular panel. And I did raise this point very clearly that she has her rights. She has her rights to privacy. You cannot share her medical information like this just because. And the journalist argued, but people want to know, like the nation wants to know now. That was the argument this person told me. But this has been a debate for the last few weeks. People want to know what exactly the medical report says. And I said they have no business whatsoever to learn about the medical report. Has Pinky heard about it? Has she read her report? No, she hasn't. And this is something that I have noticed in other cases as well. But in a very different context, when federations or international federations conduct such examination, there also doctors face this kind of dual loyalty because they are employed or recruited or commissioned by the federation, but they have somebody who is, in this case, their patient, and their loyalty should only be towards their patient. And any medical record that you have should be given to the patient. In these cases, in the context of sport, the loyalty is dual. So you have a loyalty towards the federation and also towards your patient. But often these doctors, because of the hierarchy that exists between an international federation and an athlete, they only tend to send the medical reports and medical information to the international federation. So many of these athletes across Africa, across Asia that I have worked with, tell me the same story, that we don't have our reports. In case of Shanti Soundarajan, we had to do a Right to Information Act. Of the Right to Information Act, we asked for her reports from Asian Games several years later. She herself asked for it and she got it. In other parts of the world, in some countries in Africa, there are no such similar provisions where you could have asked for your reports. But all of them talk about this. So there is this very, I don't know
Lack
how.
of transparency, yes.
Lack of transparency, but also it's a severe violation of someone's right to her own private medical records. So that has happened over and over again. But anyways, going back to the story, so that there was a lot of this kind of intervention that I happened to make during Pinky's case. But what was quite remarkable was a year after. Um, uh, through some friends, I got to connect with Chondril in Anandabajar Potrika, who was keen to have a story on Pinky by Pinky. And this was an idea that was there, in my head for some time, and I was discussing it with Pinky. And because athletes are often not so eloquent, they cannot really write their own pieces. So I helped write it with her. I remembered spending a whole day with her and sit with her and write that piece. So I was typing while she was talking about it. And it was about her experience in the last 1 year. This was a year after that arrest, and how she was perceived throughout that time, what she experienced, what kind of responses, reactions she got when she got back to working as a ticket checker. And it felt like finally she was sort of, she took ownership of her own story because she was telling her own story. And Andabajar Potrika Rohibashoryu published it, and not only published it, they actually had a series of hoardings across, Calcutta, saying that if you want to read Pinky Pramanik's story in her own voice, do buy Robi Bashuri on this date. So for more than a week, there was this build up to that article, and it was really a moment of, I think a moment when both Pinky and I, both of us felt that we have been able to sort of switch something around in some way. And that was one of these, one of the anecdotes that I thought I should share. Um, and then we moved on, and in 2014, Bhuti Chand is dropped from the national team. And one of these journalists, I think from Mint, got hold of me via phone and said, "Have you heard there is this athlete who has been dropped? Her name is Bhuti Chand from the Glasgow Commonwealth Games team." I said, "No, I haven't. But how do you know?" And then I figured that there was an interview that was given by somebody which kind of linked her name. So by then I knew what is it that causes maximum harm to these athletes. So especially in the context of what happened with Shanti or Pinky, I knew about it. So what I did is I got in touch with, I tried to get in touch with Bhuti, but I also got in touch with Sports Authority of India's Director General G.D. Thompson, who knew me because I was already involved in the work they were doing around the standard operative procedures the year before. And I told him that, "What have you done?" Um, and he was very receptive. He was one of those administrators who were willing to do things differently. So he said that, what should we say to the media? And I said, can I help you write your media release? I sort of volunteered to do so, and he was very happy with that. So I helped them write their media release in a way that would not raise questions about the teacher's gender. And the report, while following the regulations, because I was not myself supportive of the regulations, but a government agency, they want, as a government agency, they wanted to support the policy that was in place by the international government, body. But having said that, it can be framed in a way which is less harmful to the athletes, and therefore media messaging is so important. And it's not only about what the reporters are writing. What I realized at this point is you can actually control what is being written and printed across the country, across different media houses, by only making sure that the press release that comes from this government agency is written in a way which is supportive or at least not harmful to the athlete. So the words and the sentences we used there were quoting from the regulations, like this regulations is not trying to determine the athlete's gender. This is called hyperandrogenism regulations. This is about a certain hormone. This is not about whether the athlete is a woman or a man. When it comes to these things, federations, athletics federations of
They have to
India
abide by, yes.
is bound by the
Yes.
policies of the international federation. The government necessarily is not, but in this case, because AFI doesn't have medical, they have a medical commission though, but by then we had the SOP. SOP one needed nodal officers who are government connected, etc. The question that you were asking was about the policies, how the government is connected. The government generally tries to follow what the international federations are saying, because there is a sense of respect towards these international federations as to what they are suggesting is the right reason. In sport, we tend to look up to these international federations for policies and sport rules, right? And often these rules are considered as as something that you cannot not follow. You cannot really sort of not follow these orders. They are kind of sacrosanct. So that was that was the kind of atmosphere So they brought out that press release. Right? They brought out that press release, which was sort of supportive of the regulations. It didn't really capture my position about the regulations, but it did also make sure that, to an extent, make sure that the athlete's gender is not questioned. Yes. So that was my contribution. So Athletics Federation of India didn't have the means to really conduct an entire sort of the hyperandrogenism regulations, testing, medical test, medical assessment. So they wrote to Sports Authority of India to conduct this test. And in that also the language used was about why it was important that they do this test, because in order to avoid embarrassment at an international stage. So there is this sense of embarrassment, shame attached to these athletes. And there are many documents. We tend to talk about reportage. We tend to talk about what we read in newspapers or in electronic media, what we see. But there are all these other documents, whether it's a policy document, whether it's a standard operating procedure document, whether it's a communication between the federation and the government. These documents represent not only these, they represent these athletes, but it also sort of reflects states' ideas, yes, media fraternities' ideas. Exactly. So they also represent and a certain kind of approach or sensitivity that, or lack of sensitivity that people had towards this certain group of athletes. Because this project is conducted by two universities, I assume that the archive you are creating is not only meant for media persons but also meant for students, also going to help researchers in the future. If that is the target, then I think it shouldn't be only about the media reporting, but it should also include these government communication, policy documents, etc., because they also capture a certain kind of language that was used to identify these women, or a certain kind of approach around embarrassment and shame and suspicion that was also used in that time. And I take pride again about this whole. There's another anecdote I can share. After this whole new press release, things suddenly changed across, and people suddenly started talking about the regulation, whether she has a high level of testosterone, why is it so, whether people generally have it, etc., etc. Slightly different, not her gender. So that was the first positive step. Then I get a call from the Director General of Sport Authority of India asking me to go to Delhi. So I went there. And I was not told that I will be meeting to about 25 bureaucrats that day. But he took me to this G.G. Thompson. He took me to this room full of bureaucrats, all working in the field of sport. And he said, Payoshni, why don't you talk about what we should do around Dubhi Chand's case? And I was surprised because I was not prepared for it. But I think I more or less did a good job. And G.G. Thompson used to take decisions very quickly. And this was his way of making sure that everybody knows who he was going to give responsibility to next. And I didn't have any idea about that. So I went and I said, okay, India has had this athlete in the past. It is high time we do something about it. And it is not about taking that approach where we consider these women cheats and we ask them to leave sport, but we look at these women as our women athletes doing well and have prospects of doing well, and we stand by them. And therefore, how can we stand by them? Not by asking them to take medical steps and providing funding for the medical test or medical intervention, but by supporting them in legal action. Because by then I had spoken to Professor Bruce Kidd in Canada, who's a former Olympian, um, chief of Cabos. At that time, he was chairing the Commonwealth Advisory Board in Sport. And he was also speaking with some of the Indian officials who visited Glasgow. And I had a chat with Bruce Kidd, and he said maybe this is the time that Duty can take this case to Court of Arbitration for Sport and challenge these regulations. So I had to convince the Indian government that you support Duty, stand by her, and take this case to Lausanne to challenge the very regulations, because the regulations are not based on scientific evidence. So working with journalists have been an everyday thing for me. And it is not only in the context of India, but given my work, which became quite international later on, and having worked with several of African athletes as well, and being in Europe, being through, sort of geographically closer to these international federations, there is a lot of work that goes on with journalists. Now, I will start with one article that was written by New York Times on Duti Chand in 2014, where both of us were featured, our photographs were there, and all of that. Now, I remember very correctly that the New York Times journalist wanted to visit Duti's village, and I said maybe not a good idea, because I felt it might bring back the scrutiny around her in the immediate village. So there, those kind of sort of, on making them understand the cultural context, also changing the language. I've done a lot of work with journalists. You'll be surprised to know, and this is not something that even the individual journalist would share with their legal department, because they're not supposed to share their written articles. But a lot of times they would personally either read it out to you to get your views on whether it is safe for the athlete, whether it is right for the athlete, whether the language is correct. So I have had these individual relationships with journalists where they will call up and read out their article, and I'll say, no, maybe you shouldn't use gonads is a right word, not testicles. So you sort of make these kind of comments, and they have been receptive. And this is not only in India, but international. I've had journalists in Western European countries, or in the US, or in Australia, even in South America, Africa, where I had the opportunity to directly contribute to how it's being written, how it's being presented, even if it's a documentary, the BBC, anywhere. So that has been a lot of my work, and a lot of the work has been in the background and mostly unpaid, of course, which has been a struggle. But this has been very important, and the fact that there was this interest and curiosity in this particular topic meant a lot of media persons gradually became interested, but they didn't know how to report. And I have seen the same kind of, sort of language issues being, sort of replicated everywhere. So the same kind of questions around gender, the same kind of word about whether to use testicles, gonads, internal sex organs. What is the correct language? Everywhere, journalists are also worried about using a word which is completely unknown to the public. Will testosterone make sense as testosterone to people? Or should we call male hormone? A lot of Bengali media would call male hormone, and I have very, sort of aggressively worked with each of them, trying to tell them you cannot write male hormone. At some point, testosterone used to be called male hormone, but it is not a male hormone. Signs of yes. All women have testosterone, men have testosterone, and there are variety. We have different levels of testosterone. So the moment you call it a male hormone, you're also assigning an idea of sex and gender to it, and therefore you cannot. But nobody will understand if I say testosterone, but you'll have to start it. If you start using it, people will one day understand. Yes. So those kind of conversations, where you cannot use male hormone because that's going to have a negative impact. That happened very much as well with with some journalists, not many, because especially in recent times at the international level, I think journalists are way more respectful about the rapport they create with people like us. And But then this happened in India, where I felt, when Duti Chand decided to come out, Obviously, I was very close to her as an advisor, initially appointed by the government. So I was very much aware of Duti's sexuality. Yeah, I've been close to her. My relationship started as a government advisor to her, but then she was young and I became kind of a mentor. So I knew about it. And we have had discussions about whether to come out or not. And since she was focusing on training at that point, I did advise her, I will accept it, that I advised her not to come out at that point because I wasn't sure how the government will respond, how her sponsors will respond, etc. There are perceptions about her already because of the fight she took to Cass. So I was being in a way protective, not thinking like an activist, you know. I was thinking like sort of a mother, I believe, in some ways, if I may say so, and without being patronizing. But Jyoti is this very different person as well, who often surprised me and taught me a lot as well. So she decided one fine day that she must talk about it to the media, and she did. In spite of meetings, having a long call with her the night before, I wake up to the news that the world know that Tiduti, as a woman likes women. And I saw that the journalist who broke that news was someone I knew closely, and I had worked very closely with. For often we these kind of conversations are what is the right language, please change the language, or this is a report that publish it in this way at this point. You have sort of constantly strategizing. You have a media strategy as an activist, which I didn't know I was doing at that time, but I was actually doing that. So I had this very good relationship with the journalist, but when it came to deciding whether I get to publish a breaking news to the world, as opposed to whether I should think of the what is right for the athlete. Especially in this case, she was by then an adult and she was deciding for herself. So I really didn't have a say. I was a bit, at that point, I was a bit unhappy about the fact that Duty didn't take my advice, and also unhappy about the fact that the journalist who broke the news to the world could have consulted me before publishing it. Um, and I'm being very frank, not many people would appreciate what I am saying because I see that I was trying to control things where I shouldn't have tried. But, you know, you do all kinds of things. You do want to control the media messaging. Um, all the time as an activist, to be fair. So at that time, I didn't realize that this is actually going to be received so positively. And she became a bigger icon than she was before. And I didn't see that coming. And a lot of my friends from the community, I'm an ally to the LGBTIQ community, they would feel terrible about what I am saying today. But, all of us have faults and shortcomings. It's a learning process. Duty has always surprised me with doing things very differently, or sort of when I would be very tense, saying something to me, which would be like, okay, on the day when the results were about to come from Court of Arbitration for Sport, I was so tense and down. And she said, "You've done whatever you had to do. Uh, you should just be relaxed and wait for the judgment." Neetu's story was quite a story of being married off in a remote village. Also, there are caste issues which wasn't captured because she didn't want to talk about it much. So it wasn't captured in that interview because of that reason. But there were caste issues that she faced. Wrestling is a physical sport. It's a contact sport, and therefore, if you are from a lower caste, there could be people who may not want to wrestle with you. So you're not getting enough practice. And these are issues that she has faced, but she didn't really talk about it. And I'm sure there are other men and women from lower castes in wrestling who face similar issues. Neetu's story was obviously about uh, very early marriage and then sexually abused by the father-in-law, then sort of somehow escapes that sort of runs away from that house, goes back to her paternal home, then gets married to another person called Sanjay, who's been a very supportive husband to her. And after giving birth to a twin, she wanted to become a wrestler. And she became a wrestler, and she started. Wearing salwar kameez. She started jogging early in the morning in the village, and people started in Haryana. They started talking about this bahu who is suddenly running around. Initially in salwar kameez, then in track pants, and they were not really appreciative. Um, very critical of what she was doing and her family, why they were allowing her to do. That's not the kind of approach the women hardly have make their decisions in these cultures. And from then, that sent to becoming one of the national games medalists, and then going to I think Brazil, somewhere sort of in some other continent, and then they suddenly realize that her name is in the newspaper, and that's again an interesting connection to this particular project. Her game, her story, I think, is the fact that when she's trying to train, wanting to be a wrestler, a married woman with kids, people are not appreciative. But the moment they see her achievements in a newspaper, the panchayat people, the village, they started saying that because of you, our village's name is in the newspaper. So we should be proud of you. So suddenly overnight, she's received with garlands and everything, and she becomes a star in the village. And not really international, because nobody is going to read the New York Times there. Yes, but even in the Hindi or in the local media, the fact that the name is, it's a small village. So that kind of changed her life in the village. So it is also something that tells us about if the worth of journalism, yes. The worth of journalism on one hand, but also as a woman athlete, yes, you have to really be exceptional to be accepted. Otherwise, your story isn't of any value. But at the same time, Nitu's story got featured in English language media as well, because she was this mother of twins and all of that. That because Mary Kom was huge as well, being a mother and a boxer and a champion for several years. And that was a huge story in those days. In 2012, I remember one of the international magazines had her on the cover saying mother of two. At that time, she had two. Now she has three. And even now, if you look at it, when Kim Clijsters, for example, came questions that child, Serena with Olympia, and all of these, you constantly see that the idea of being a mother and a champion athlete is great. We necessarily do not see so much with the male athletes being fathers and being parents, but I also understand why that is the case, because it's such a physical thing for women. I mean, obviously, mothers, especially being athletes, it's way more complex. But in recently, I was quite pleased to see Rafa Nadal's son, Junior Rafa, as photographs as he's playing, and the child is watching from the stands, and that being sort of in the news quite a bit. So it was refreshing to see that Rafa's son is getting quite a bit, and Rafa's father is getting quite a bit of attention as well. But these are sort of yes, physicality. It's especially in the context of mother, I understand in many ways, but also sort of often forgetting other athletes. I mean, if you're not a mother, you're still, you might have a great story, and that isn't as great often if you have a traditional minded media house. Then you're not interested in someone who's not a mother and a champion. Those kind of things. So you do see sometimes sport as an institution, and sport as a culture, and sport as media sport. They have always taken interest only in excellence. This is not new, whether it is men's sport or women's sport. It is all about excellence. And the focus is on excellence. Focus is on national pride, representing the nation, winning medals for the nation. So it's all about that. And sport helps in nation building in that way as well. So we have seen that over and over again, and therefore you will see very little of this recreational sport or sport as a medium for other kinds of life skills. So you can go into individual sport as well, and you will see their journey and their history and their trajectory is very different. Kabaddi and cricket will be very different from one another. Team sport and individual sport again will be very different. Tennis, for example, has a very different trajectory. But again, tennis and badminton have very different trajectories. Tennis being coming from the West, whereas badminton has always been quite big in Asia. Asia as a market is now recognized way more than when we were growing up. So all of that obviously is there, but I think it's sports is focused generally on excellence, which makes the media also focus very little uh, on the recreational part of sport. 2007, when I was doing my PhD in Khidarpur, already there were girls boxing, and boxing wasn't an Olympic sport at that time. So there wasn't much money in this sport. If you're not an Olympic sport, you don't get government funding because there is no scope for medals in Olympics or participating in the Olympics. So non-Olympic sports are always they suffer a lot. So women's boxing wasn't part of Olympic sport in 2007, but at that time I was doing my PhD, so I visited them and then decided to submit one of my chapters as an audiovisual document and did this 15-minute or 16-minute long documentary called The Bold and the Beautiful. And I would give a different name today and make that film differently today. But having said that, it was quite an interesting experience where you see that this is 2007, and obviously post the 1990s, when there was a shift in how the Indian Muslim is responding to the changes around. And you suddenly see that these women who all are from families and mostly from Muslim families in Khidirpur area, their families were mostly supportive of these women, young girls competing in boxing, because I think in some way they felt that this is a form of also martial art or some form of learning to save yourself and defend yourself, and therefore often parents were happy to do that. But also a couple of other things came up during that war. One was a couple of mothers talked about how हमें भी यही ख्वाहिश थी. We also had the same wish, but our parents didn't allow us to play sports. So mothers wanting their daughters to play sport and living their dreams through them. Uh, it was one of the things that came up. And the other, I remember one of the fathers constantly talking about how jang ke jaisa hai. Like, I would love my daughters to go and fight for the country. And when you are competing in boxing, there is that hope that they will one day fight for their country. And there was this whole sort of idea of nationalism being brought in. But you also see how, as sort of Muslim families already in those days, there was this sort of need to emphasize your identity as an Indian over your identity as a Muslim girl. And so those things in 2007 I had been, and it was quite before 2012 when finally boxing, women's boxing was introduced in London, and Mary Kom goes and wins that bronze medal. But it was quite an interesting one. I think it's worth mentioning.